Okay, welcome to this community event for Remote AF. Just here to introduce Ben. I've hijacked Tony's event because that's exactly what I like to do on a Friday afternoon. So Ben is a wizard of OKRs, and he's the man that can make your Kanban do the things it can do. And he's going to share with us today some of his wisdom of helping OKRs be a powerful tool at a distance. So with that, I'll pipe down and hand over to Ben.
Yeah, thanks very much, John. Yeah, really good to be here. So I've got just 20 minutes of random thoughts. I put together a little thought about what does OKRs look like in a remote context. In particular, two things, like how do you introduce them completely remotely, and what role do they have for remote teams that might be a bit different than on site. So I guess like a lot of us, when the pandemic came along, I worked almost exclusively remotely. Just wondering what percentage of the audience have been remote of this crew. So maybe just put in chat what percentage of remote you think you are. Like how many is it? Do you measure it in hours or days or weeks in a year that you're actually on site? Interested to get a sense. How remote have you all been over the last little while?
Minutes.
Minutes online, yeah, on site. Craig,
what about you? I thought you said minutes on site.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like I would say my on site in the building off hours are probably under 4 hours a month.
Yeah. Yeah. Very similar, even less for me, I think. What about you, Andrew?
1 day a fortnight.
1 day a fortnight? Okay, that's pretty high, yeah, compared to the rest of us. Wow, a whole day every 2 weeks.
It's actually going up. Like I think from next week.
2 days this year.
2 days this year for Andrew. I think Andrew wins. Okay. So, and Pradeep, I don't know if you've put it in chat. I can't see chat for some reason. I apologize if you're chatting to me. Maybe, John, you can.
So from Andrew, we've got that he's also quite remote emotionally. Pradeep is mostly from home, and I'm fully remote, but not as mobile as I'd like.
Yeah, fair enough. So yeah, I started the Freshwater Academy thing during the pandemic, and of course, I think Andrew and I were having the same thought at the same time, which was like, oh, it's a pandemic, everyone's on lockdown, there's an opportunity for a new business. And so Remote Agility Framework was born about the same time as this Freshwater Academy idea was. And obviously in both cases conceived at 100% remote first, the training and the education part. So yeah, I guess I saw a need for organizations still to grow capabilities across, for me, it was like product operations, product discovery, product management, delivery management, those kinds of topics, but how to do this really well remotely. And all the early referrals I got were, oh, can you help us implement OKRs? Because I'd done one at scale implementation in Berlin back in 2018. So yeah, basically I ended up spending the first few years of this remote working trying to implement OKRs completely remotely. So organizations like Domain Group, New Zealand government, IO's a small startup basically, and all those OKR implementations were done completely remotely. You had to create the communities of practice, had to do the training, like create change without actually being on site. So that was a bit different. So I thought it might be appropriate just to share a couple of the tools and experiences of doing that. For anyone who hasn't done OKR training, then just want to give you an example of what an OKR is, what the hell we're talking about. So here you can see an example which is like literally saving the world from the climate disaster, and that's the objective. It has a key result, which is to reduce net carbon emissions, as we know, from some amount, something like 36 billion tonnes a year to zero by 2050. But I also like to split out this third section, which is the activities, to separate your outputs from your outcomes. So yeah, on the surface, they're basically a really small document. You know, it's like like 2 paragraphs worth of stuff, maybe even less. So as a written artifact, it reminds me a lot of a user story where you have like, as a blah, I want blah, so that. It's like this really tiny little token, but I think it's an interesting token for conversation. And we talk about using user stories and backlog items, importantly, in working with teams. And I think OKRs are a bit like that. They're like a token for a conversation. So yeah, people often ask, why do they do them? And it's either like, for one client, it was definitely because they were doing too much stuff. they needed to cut down on how many like things they were trying to go for simultaneously. For another client, it was engagement. It was, you know, we did a survey and in Culture Amp, and everyone said, we don't feel connected to purpose. We don't know what our strategy is. We don't understand the goals of the organization. But the one today I wanted to talk about a bit was about alignment. This idea of how do you get a bunch of remote people working on maybe different teams to align across functions and across teams. So obviously it's a really common problem whether you're remote or not to find yourself working at cross purposes, maybe having competing priorities. I think that's a really common issue in any scaled organization. But I think it's becoming newly critical for remote and hybrid teams, this ability for trying to understand and align what everyone else is doing, like across the teams and across the org. So I think the situation is that remote teams don't have this advantage of kind of osmotic alignment. They can't walk around an office and look at what other people are doing and sort of bump into someone and be like, oh yeah, you guys are working on that. So I reckon a lot of alignment happens accidentally in on-site organizations. So I think there's something significant there about alignment. So particularly the asynchronous thing. So I guess as an organization gets better at working remotely, inevitably, I guess we start doing more and more of that work asynchronously. And you can tell whether an organization's good at being remote is because if their calendars are back-to-back Zoom meetings, they haven't quite got here yet. But eventually you'll get sick of having Zoom meetings all day, every day. And you'll think, maybe I could write some stuff down. Maybe we could do this work asynchronously so I don't have to have another damn meeting. So what that means obviously is more written documentation and more information that's shared online rather than spoken word. And I think when you're thinking about your remote strategy, you're kind of thinking about a knowledge management strategy here. Like as we go more asynchronous, I need to put certain information that's important in certain places. And I think OKRs can be thought of as like an anchor for your organization. You could use them as an index into all the work that the organization does. They're quite short, as I said, just like a product backlog item gives you an index into a project. I think OKRs can give an index into the outcomes that an organization's looking for. And they're published in a single location, just like a product backlog. You've basically got your organizational list of OKRs that's in a known location. And it allows you to navigate, I think, both to and from related information. So if you, like many organizations, have terrible knowledge management, no concept of information architecture, stuff is in every tool, like where is it, who do I talk to? Maybe OKRs are an option to like create a single place where the really important stuff is, what we're actually trying to achieve. So I think that's an interesting use of OKRs. So let's talk about just quickly my experience of implementing change remotely. So that's also interesting. Like how do you go in as a change agent and get, let's say, 700 people to start using OKRs when they don't really want to? So that's a really interesting kind of situation to be in. So I think we have this vision, right, of a charismatic leader or a consultant who through sheer force of personality, like turns up, maybe a bit like Phil, and through sheer force of personality, they affect like big positive change in an organization. And I'm sure some of you have seen that, but I think a lot of us have seen that not work. Andrew's like, yeah, Phil was who I was thinking of. So I'm sure most people know that this isn't maybe the most repeatable, reliable way of getting change to work. If you're very lucky to have a Phil, you're great. But if you don't, then you're going to need some other change approach that might work both remotely and with maybe participation and ownership from those involved in the change. So an example of this is maybe how I implemented OKRs in Sydney while being in lockdown for 6 months in Melbourne. So I wasn't allowed to go visit my client, but I still had to implement OKRs. And so the answer is, of course, do it very slowly. Do it like piece by piece. Use some kind of adoption strategy that's incremental. So we used 4 stages. The first one was nail the why. That's pretty classic. Talk to people, figure out why you're doing it. The second one was interesting because that was the learning and experimentation time where we deliberately set it up as a pilot. And then we slowly extended across the org team by team until finally we started having arguments about what tools should we use, what governance and you know, who's in charge of this thing, and like who's the program owner. And lastly, like how do we in this in terms of onboarding new staff, like what's our training strategy? So yeah, I think one of the big parts of that is how do you increase capability? You're trying to uplift capability across, like, let's say 700 people. As I said, we're doing that incrementally. So our first cohort is quite small. And in that instance, my thought was, I think similar to what Andrew did for Remote Agility Framework, I want my training to be really engaging and completely online so I can deliver it to these cohorts without ever having to be in an office. So I wanted to just share a little bit of the training design for my OKR course as an example of like sort of the remote training approach. So I might have to stop sharing and then share again so we can have a look in here. So this is my, like, you know, hi Craig, coming in. Let me share my screen again. Window. Okay, so here's the secret sauce, right? This is an actual, I've changed the names to protect the innocent, but here's an actual, in this case, a mural whiteboard that I use to teach OKRs remotely to some teams. And similar to RAF, we've got like a story me type thing, but what's noteworthy is you've got these objects that you can like literally move around, which is kind of, seems like trivial, but I think the key design principle we're looking for here is that there is interactivity. We want the participants participating from the start and throughout the remote engagement. So this applies to workshops, it applies to trainings, sometimes called flipped classroom, where you do the boring stuff asynchronously, but you do the interactive stuff in the meeting. And so now we've got video lessons for all the boring stuff, like all the boring what is an OKR stuff. There's videos for that now. I can send them out to people and then do more fun things like, I love John Smart's thing about like, are you top down or bottom up? Are you focused on outputs or are you focused on outcomes? Do you plan just annually or do you plan more than that? And I got teams to like use the idea of moving a circle around to kind of agree on where they were at in their implementation of OKRs, and then went on to do other sort of card sorting activities. So I found that, you know, quite a useful way to design the training in that more interactive way. More participation, less talking, I guess. It seems obvious if you've done any training, but I think it's very much a consequence of trying to engage people remotely. I think it's more important that people are participating than just listening like you are now. So one lesson that was quite hard to teach remotely is that you don't want to write your OKRs as a to-do list. So that's the classic, you know, first OKR, I write down a list of activities or projects. And if you look at them, let me share that screen again so you can see what I'm talking about. There we go. Thanks, Pepper. So yeah, as you can see here, a classic first OKR that you're trying to teach is not to do it this way. Don't write down the design and launch, and you know, don't write down a list of to-do things in your key results. Instead, what you want to do is separate out those activities, initiatives, and milestones into a separate section from your key results. So I call these OKRs, you know, objectives, key results, and activities. And the interesting thing is, how do you teach this? So I use the card sort mechanism, but I also use collaborative Google Documents. So I think from a remote context, we're used to collaborating in Google Docs, Google Sheets, Google Slides. And I found that in practice, when you're implementing something remotely, you're going to be doing a lot of that. And so having a shared location where everyone can type in and we can see what people are typing, and more importantly, we can real time give feedback on that, was a really useful training technique. So you can download this canvas if you want. This is the one I used in the trainings, canvas.freshwater.academy if you want a copy. All it is just basically a spot where someone can write down an objective, write down their key results, and write down their activities. What's interesting here is not the form, but it's the function in a remote context where everyone is editing the same document at the same time. And I think that's the interesting part, where we're live online, we're all putting words into one place. And I think that gives you this kind of anchor to talk about your OKRs. So you can use Miro, you can use lots of different types of tools for this. I happen to use Google Slides in this instance, and I found that worked pretty well for this particular use case, teaching someone to write their OKRs for the first time. This also has a checklist so people can see some examples of what to do, what not, and so on. So yeah, once you've taught people how to write an OKR, you think, yeah, great, I'm finished, right? I'm done. That's it. I've set my OKRs. God, that was hard. I must be finished. But of course, there's a lot more to it. And as you know, when you're starting out, one of the most common mistakes is to set and forget. Philippe Castro likes to say, don't treat your OKRs like a New Year's resolution. Don't like write it down, then look at it 3 months or 12 months later and be surprised that you haven't achieved it. So there's two stages that Felipe and I like to talk about, which is the align and achieve stage. And I added the fourth, the reflect stage. And that's this alignment and achievement process, I think, is where the magic happens. And again, in a remote context, I think it's the alignment that's kind of hard. Like alignment, you can imagine aligning people by getting them all in a room and somehow magic would happen. If you can't get people in the room, how do you align people? So Felipe's got this individual alignment technique, which is effectively an owner of an OKR will go and talk to everyone they need to individually. That's one technique, right? You go and talk to every single person that is a supporter, a dependency, a stakeholder. You basically socialize your OKR around the org using a lot of legwork, right? That's one way of doing it. And that works sometimes, but you need very motivated OKR owners. So I created the checklist and the template and the canvas to help OKR owners do this, but it's not necessarily something that is going to get you all the alignment you need. So what's more interesting is like, how do you do this alignment at scale? How do you do it with large groups of people? So one client has one person review every OKR and manually try to figure out where the duplication is and where the alignment issues are, and then process that and then play it back to the org. And that only works, I think, because they're quite small. So I think that worked up to about 10 teams or so. They were able to have one person do the alignment in their head. But for more complex alignment, I think the workshop is an obvious solution there. And in person, this would be on a whiteboard, but virtually you can have it, like people synchronize a Miro board, for example, and you're literally mapping which OKRs lined up to which OKRs. And I find tree structures really helpful here, where you're building a tree structure in something like Miro, and that helps you map out the relationship between everyone's different objectives. Importantly, what you're looking for here is opportunities to create shared OKRs, to deduplicate your key results and objectives, and to organize yourselves around really important outcomes. Rather than having one OKR split across many teams, you're trying to use this activity to group them together. So there's lots of tools you could that claim to have support for this. So this is an example of Tability, which is a tool in Australia. And Sten set up an example. If you're interested, I can take you through a walkthrough. There's plenty of them. I've used GTM Hub, Tability, WorkPath, and quite a lot of Excel and PowerPoint as alignment tools in terms of so Excel, is there anything you can't do with a shared spreadsheet really, or Google Sheets? But what's interesting about this view is it can show you how your OKRs roll up in a piece of software. But what's more interesting than using tools for alignment, which I think isn't that interesting, is to use a tool for remote achievement. So by achievement, I mean the process of actually achieving your results. And so I think that's the critical weekly discipline of doing check-ins, basically making OKRs part of your operational rhythm. So in face-to-face teams, that's like a flip chart. Every week we come around a flip chart and we write on it and we say, yeah, it's going well. Are we tracking? Are we not? In asynchronous or remote teams, I think that weekly check-in could be mostly asynchronous and it can mostly be done in a tool. So I see products like Atlassian Atlas, which is new, and this one, Tability, are quite good at allowing a team member to make an update on the key results each week and have that roll up with things like comments, reactions, and a visualization of progress. You can also see how this is a place to link to initiatives. So for example, to and from Jira. This is where I see like an OKR tool linking into Jira and a Jira tool linking back into an OKR tool. I think that's really useful to create that traceability. So if you're really interested in traceability from outcome all the way through to Jira item, I really love this article. One of my favorite articles, I've been sharing this a lot recently. It's by Jason Doherty. It talks about the mapping of outcomes to output. So all the way from product vision and goals through outcomes to opportunities, ideas, solutions, features, and stories. And I think for remote teams, this level of clarity becomes super important because teams are autonomous, they're asynchronous. How do we know how our work applies to this sort of tree of needs? And I think it's more important to have these systems in place that give you traceability and transparency. And I think you want your information architecture to look something like this. You want a place where maybe your OKR system is this, maybe it's a wiki, but you're thinking about it in terms of being able to navigate up and down this tree. And I really like that as a structure to think about. So we've got a couple of minutes left. So I'll just whiz through the last phases, which is reflect, the final phase in OKRs. And if you're doing remote reflection, you can borrow tools for remote retros. So if you've ever done a big retro remotely, it's kind of the same. You might kick off by reviewing your OKR. In this case, it was a OKR for OKRs. But then we ran the retro as you'd expect. It was a mural board. We got everyone to talk about what worked well and didn't work well about OKRs as a retrospective. But we structured it around the key results. So for every key result, we had a theme. So every key result became a retrospective theme, and we then voted and did all the usual things to reflect on what are we going to change about the next cycle. Yeah, so that's kind of the end of that cycle, and then you need to extend it. You've done that maybe for 3 or 4 teams, but if you've got a very large organization, let's say 700 people, you're going to need to look at legal and finance and how you're going to extend that capability. And to do that, you want some kind of community of practice, OKR champions program. And I typically support that with remote tools like Slack or things like that. And so Phil's saying he's got 18,000 people to make change to. So yeah, obviously that's going to take time. So I think that's really interesting. So I think these communities of practice become really important to both scale knowledge, but to sustain that change, you kind of need to embed it in your operating model. So that means roles and responsibilities and development. And I think the one scaling trick beyond OKR Champions program, which was great, was to offer the OKR Champions training, right? So train the trainer was kind of the scaling approach there. And so I basically put together slides, videos, Miro templates, Google Docs and canvases and facilitation guides, gave them to the OKR champions. And the idea was they would then train their teams in OKRs rather than I couldn't do it all myself. And so that became the scaling model. And that was pretty successful as it allowed them to sort of customize the curriculum to make it their own and then run it fully remotely often. So that's it. So I think when we look at remote OKRs, we talked about understanding the why, Zoom interviews, online surveys. We talked about learning, remote OKR training, collaborative canvases like Google Docs. When we talked about extending, we talked about alignment canvases, alignment mirrors. We talked about tool support, online check-ins, traceability through the tree, online retrospectives. And then in sustaining, we talked about, again, training materials and video onboarding tools as a way to scale that. So that's kind of the remote OKR story in 20 minutes. Obviously, really happy to chat to anyone who would like more details or want to try some of these things. So yeah, thanks very much, everyone. That was my implementing OKRs remotely in 20 minutes.